Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Please drop a like or comment if you want to help the channel. Now let's get into the true scary stories. The shadow in the corner. It started like any other evening. The wind outside murmured through the gaps in the window frame, a gentle, familiar sound that had always lulled me to sleep. My room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. As I lay in bed, I scrolled mindlessly through my phone, trying to chase away that strange, lingering unease that sometimes creeps in during the quiet hours of the night. It was just me, the silence, and the faint shadows playing across the walls. Or so I thought. For weeks, I had noticed something odd in the corner of my room, near the closet. It was nothing at first, a bundle of clothes I had carelessly thrown there after a particularly long day. But, over time, the shape of it had started to feel wrong. Every now and then, I would catch myself staring at it for just a little too long, as if trying to convince myself that it was truly nothing. "It's just clothes," I would whisper under my breath, forcing a chuckle before rolling over and pulling the covers up to my chin. I hadn't thought much of it, until tonight. I glanced toward the corner, like I had so many times before, expecting the same lump of discarded sweaters and jeans. But tonight, something was different. The figure seemed taller, darker, as though it had grown since the last time I looked. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and tried to make sense of it. I blinked rapidly, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no matter how long I stared, the figure remained. Still. Silent. Watching. It wasn't moving, not yet. But somehow, I knew it could. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I forced myself to breathe, to reason with myself. "It's nothing, just a pile of clothes. You're tired. You're overthinking." My internal reassurances felt weak, fragile, like they could snap at any second. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't look away. My eyes were glued to the figure, every muscle in my body screaming for me to stay alert. Suddenly, the faintest of creaks echoed from the corner. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but in the stillness of my room, it sounded deafening. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I squinted, straining to see if anything had changed. The shape shifted, subtly, but unmistakably. My heart hammered in my chest, a sense of dread curling around me like a cold, suffocating fog. I wanted to reach for my phone, to turn on the light, but fear kept me frozen in place. The air in the room seemed to thicken, as if the darkness itself was closing in on me. Then, it happened. The figure stood up. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, every muscle stiffening as if I had turned to stone. The shadowy figure, once a harmless pile of clothes, had unfolded itself from the corner, rising in a slow, deliberate motion. It was tall, taller than it had any right to be, with limbs that seemed too long and too thin. A soft, scraping sound accompanied the movement, like fabric brushing against skin, but there was no sound of footsteps. Just the shifting of something that shouldn't have been there. I wanted to scream. I wanted to bolt out of bed and run to the door, but my legs wouldn't move. All I could do was sit there, watching as this thing loomed closer. Its form was still indistinct, shrouded in shadow. My brain raced to make sense of what I was seeing, but no explanation would stick. It wasn't a person, it couldn't be. There was something wrong about the way it moved, too fluid yet somehow jagged, as though its joints bent in directions they shouldn't. The room felt colder, like the air itself had turned hostile, and the figure kept approaching. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that maybe if I didn't look, it would go away. But the moment I closed my eyes, I heard it, a low, whispering sound, barely audible, but unmistakably there. "Why? Are you here?" The voice rasped, a broken, hollow sound that seemed to scrape against my bones. It was close, far too close. I opened my eyes, and the figure had stopped at the foot of my bed, looming over me like some grotesque specter. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest, I was sure it would hear. I didn't. I choked on the words, unsure if I was even speaking to it or to myself. My voice came out as a shaky whisper, "I didn't mean to." The figure remained motionless for a moment, its head tilting slightly, as though considering my response. In the dim light, I still couldn't make out any features, just the suggestion of a face where its head should be. My body shook with fear, but I couldn't stop staring at it. There was something magnetic about the darkness surrounding it, pulling me in despite every instinct screaming to look away. Suddenly, the thing leaned forward, its breath, or whatever passed for breath, was cold as ice, brushing against my face. I tried to lean back, but there was nowhere to go. My spine pressed against the headboard, and I felt trapped, caged in by this nightmare come to life. Its voice whispered again, louder this time, "You. Let me in." My mind reeled. Let it in? What did that even mean? I hadn't done anything, had I? I racked my brain, trying to remember if I had somehow invited this thing into my room, into my life. And then, the memories rushed back like a flood. Weeks ago, when I first noticed the shape in the corner, I had joked about it, hadn't I? Late at night, with friends over a video call, I had laughed and said something stupid like, "It's probably a ghost. Maybe if I'm lucky, it'll keep me company." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Was that it? Had those careless words, spoken in jest, somehow opened a door to this horror? I didn't mean to, I whispered again, as if my regret could undo what had already been set in motion. But the figure didn't care. It loomed even closer now, until I could feel the pressure of its presence bearing down on me, suffocating. Its shadow stretched across my bed, swallowing me whole. And then, without warning, the thing's hand, or what I assumed was a hand, shot forward, its cold, bony fingers curling around my wrist. I gasped, trying to yank my arm away, but its grip was iron, unyielding. I could feel its touch, icy and unnatural, seeping into my skin. Panic surged through me as the whisper returned, now more forceful and sinister. "You belong to me now." Its grip tightened around my wrist, cold as death, and for the first time, I felt real terror. Not the fleeting kind you get from a nightmare you wake up from, but the kind that digs deep into your bones, reminding you there's no escape. I struggled, pulling and twisting, but it was no use. The figure held me effortlessly, as though my resistance was nothing more than a weak inconvenience. "Please," I cried, my voice trembling, barely more than a whimper. "Let me go." But my words fell into the oppressive silence, swallowed by the room that had grown impossibly still. The figure didn't respond, at least not in the way I expected. It didn't speak this time. Instead, the shadows around it seemed to thicken, growing darker, deeper. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in around me, suffocating me in this ever-tightening grip of fear. Then, it moved again, its hand sliding down my arm with a grotesque slowness, and I felt my body begin to tremble uncontrollably. My skin crawled where its fingers trailed, as though something far worse than cold was sinking into me. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat, frozen by the horror of it all. My mind raced with desperate thoughts, pleading for someone, anyone, to burst into the room and pull me out of this nightmare. But the door remained closed, and the only sound I could hear was the faint hum of the streetlight outside, a cruel reminder that the world continued as normal while I was trapped in this terror. Suddenly, the figure leaned down, closer than it had before, its face, or the absence of it, just inches from mine. I could feel the freezing void where its breath should have been, and the darkness behind its shadowed form seemed to pulse, almost alive. For the first time, I felt like it was truly looking at me, as though those empty, hollow eyes could see straight through me, into the darkest corners of my soul. "You let me in," it rasped again, and this time, there was a hunger in its voice. As if it wasn't satisfied with merely frightening me, it wanted more. Its shadow stretched farther, crawling up the walls, over the ceiling, until the entire room seemed to pulse with the same unnatural darkness that clung to the figure. The pressure in the air was unbearable, thick and suffocating, pushing against me from all sides. I thrashed against its grip, finally managing to wrench my hand free, but it was too late. The room had already transformed. The darkness was no longer confined to the figure in the corner, it had consumed everything. My bed, the walls, even the window where the streetlight had shone just moments ago were now swallowed by shadow. I was trapped, and the only thing I could see was the looming figure, its tall, thin frame standing over me like a predator preparing to strike. Desperation clawed at my chest. I reached blindly toward the nightstand, my fingers scrambling for my phone, anything that might bring some light into the room. I felt the cool, hard surface of the screen and pressed the button, praying for the familiar glow to cut through the darkness. But when the light came on, it revealed something far worse than I had imagined. The room wasn't my room anymore. The shadows had twisted the space into something unrecognizable. The walls were closer, warped and bent at unnatural angles, and the floor was covered in strange, writhing shapes that slithered just out of sight. The figure remained in the center of it all, standing taller now, almost triumphant, as if it had dragged me into its own world, its domain. I gasped, backing up against the headboard, realizing with a sinking horror that I was no longer in control. Whatever this thing was, it had me completely in its grasp. Just as I thought the nightmare couldn't get any worse, I felt it again, its hand, now resting lightly on my shoulder. The touch sent a cold shock through my body, and I flinched, terrified of what it might do next. But instead of pulling me deeper into the dark, the figure whispered once more, its voice low and taunting. "Now, it's your turn to stay." Before I could react, the shadows surged forward, swallowing me whole. The darkness consumed me, dragging me into a place where light had no meaning. I could feel the cold, slick shadows wrapping around my limbs, pulling me deeper and deeper. My heart raced, my breaths coming in ragged gasps as I fought against it, but it was like sinking in tar, every movement only made it worse. The figure's grip remained steady, its icy touch anchored to me, ensuring that escape was not an option. It was hard to tell if I was still in my room or if this was some twisted dimension I had been pulled into, but nothing felt real anymore. I felt weightless and crushed all at once, as if the space around me was bending and pressing in, warping reality. The figure, no, the creature, was all I could see in the inky void. It was no longer just a shadow, it had form now, a grotesque parody of a human body. Its limbs were too long, its joints twisted in ways that made me nauseous to look at. There was no face, just an endless, hungry blackness where its eyes should have been. I struggled to speak, to plead for my life, but the words wouldn't come. My voice was gone, swallowed by the same crushing emptiness that had devoured the room. My chest tightened, panic rising in a way that felt unstoppable, but there was no outlet for it. No screams, no cries for help. The thing leaned closer, its breath, if it could even be called that, sending icy tendrils creeping up my spine. "You're part of it now," it rasped, the words slithering out of the darkness like a terrible secret. I wanted to ask what it meant, but deep down, I already knew. This wasn't just some haunting, some malevolent spirit looking to scare me off. No, this was far worse. The realization crashed over me like a wave, this creature hadn't just entered my room. I had entered its world. Suddenly, I was falling. The shadows beneath me opened up, and I plunged downward, as though the floor had dissolved into nothingness. My stomach lurched, and I flailed wildly, grasping for anything, but there was nothing to hold on to, just the infinite darkness swallowing me. For a brief moment, I thought this was the end, that I would fall forever. But then I slammed into something hard, cold, and solid, my body jolting painfully as I landed. I groaned, trying to push myself up, my limbs trembling from shock. The ground beneath me was rough, cold stone. My breath fogged in the frigid air as I took in my new surroundings. I was no longer in my room, this place was a dungeon of sorts, with walls made of slick, dripping black stone. Dim, flickering torches lined the walls, casting sickly light over the grotesque carvings etched into the surface, twisted faces, gnarled hands reaching out in eternal agony. The figure was gone. But I could still feel its presence, lingering in the corners, watching. I shivered, realizing that this place, wherever I was, belonged to it. I stood, legs shaking, and stumbled forward, searching for an exit, some way out of this nightmare. The tunnel stretched endlessly before me, winding deeper into the darkness. The air was heavy, oppressive, and every step I took felt like it was being monitored. A soft whisper echoed behind me, followed by another and another. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my throat. Shadows shifted along the walls, but no figure emerged. Instead, I saw faces in the stone, terrified, pleading faces frozen in silent screams. My stomach twisted in horror. Were they trapped here, too? How long had they been in this prison? I had to escape. I stumbled down the corridor, the shadows closing in, whispering threats I couldn't fully understand. My only hope was to keep moving. The deeper I went, the stronger the presence became, pressing against my mind, suffocating me with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking straight into its trap. But I had no choice. Then, I saw it. At the end of the tunnel, a faint light flickered. An exit, maybe? I pushed myself forward, my pulse racing with a sliver of hope. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the shadows seemed to writhe, eager to pull me back. My legs felt like lead, but I forced them to move. I reached the end, desperate to escape whatever awaited me in this hellish place. But as I stepped into the light, my heart sank. It wasn't an exit. It was my room again. Or at least, something that looked like my room. The bed was there, the same pile of clothes in the corner. The window was cracked open, letting in the cool night air. It was almost identical, almost. But there was something wrong, something just off enough to make my skin crawl. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the familiar space. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, where the pile of clothes had once been, stood the figure. This time, it was smiling. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Voice in the Dark. I started using the sleep recorder a few months ago, after a string of restless nights. At first, it was meant to track the bizarre dreams that had begun to plague my mind. Vivid, haunting images of shadowy figures lurking at the edge of my subconscious. My therapist had suggested it might help with my insomnia, to pinpoint any odd behavior or noises that might be waking me up. And for a while, it worked. The soft hum of my own breathing was oddly comforting as I listened back each morning, knowing that, for the most part, I was just like anyone else, trying to sleep. Then, 2 weeks ago, I heard it for the first time. It was subtle at first, a faint sound underneath my breathing, barely perceptible. I thought it might be the house settling or perhaps the wind outside, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. There was something, no, someone, speaking in the background. The voice wasn't mine. It wasn't a voice I recognized at all. And worse still, there was a second voice. Two people, whispering. Their words were muffled, indistinct, but they were definitely there. At first, I chalked it up to interference. Maybe the recorder had picked up some stray signal, an overlapping broadcast from a nearby house. But as I listened again, the unease settled deep in my gut. These weren't random words, it was a conversation, private, low, and growing more chilling with every replay. It wasn't just the eerie fact that two strangers were talking while I slept, it was what they were saying. The next night, I made sure to place the recorder closer to my bed. I even closed all the windows, ensuring there'd be no noise from outside. As I lay in bed, the room felt colder than usual, a creeping chill that seemed to come from the walls themselves. But I brushed it off, determined to get to the bottom of this strange occurrence. Morning came, and with it, dread. I woke with a start, heart pounding as if I'd been running from something in my sleep. I rushed to check the recorder. My hand trembled as I hit play, half expecting silence, hoping that the previous night had been some kind of fluke. But there it was again. The same two voices, clearer this time. A man and a woman, speaking in hushed tones. "We'll do it soon," the man whispered, his voice heavy with something dark. "Tonight, when he's sleeping. He won't even know." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "He won't even know." The words echoed in my mind, looping endlessly, tightening around my thoughts like a noose. Who were they talking about? Was it me? I replayed the recording, hoping, desperately, that I had misunderstood. But there it was, plain as day. I couldn't deny the fear crawling up my spine. The woman's voice followed, softer but no less unnerving. "We'll wait until after midnight," she said, her tone cold, calculated. "He never wakes up. He's clueless." A bitter chuckle, low and intimate, followed her words. I stopped the recording, my mind spinning. This couldn't be real, I thought. I had to be imagining things. Maybe the device was malfunctioning, or maybe someone had been messing with me. But the voices felt too deliberate, too personal. And they had plans. Sinister ones. By the third night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every distant car outside sent me into a spiral of paranoia. I lay there, rigid under the blankets, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, praying for silence. But there was no escaping it. The recording device sat on the bedside table like a patient witness, waiting to capture more horrors. I almost didn't want to hear it again. Almost. But curiosity, morbid, creeping curiosity, won out. I listened to the newest recording the next morning, palms slick with sweat. This time, there was no mistaking it. The voices were not just whispering, they were planning. "Everything's ready," the man said, his voice closer now, almost too close. "We just need him to stay asleep." There was a pause, long enough to make my heart race. The woman responded, her voice laced with eerie amusement. "He doesn't suspect a thing. Poor thing doesn't even know what's coming." I could feel the blood drain from my face. What was coming? My hands shook as I stopped the recording, the fear now a living thing in my chest. My apartment, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt foreign, like I was sharing it with unseen eyes. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air heavier than before. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure I wanted to find them. That night, I tried something new. I left my bedroom door open, hoping to catch a glimpse of anyone, or anything, that might be responsible. I sat up in bed for hours, my eyes burning from lack of sleep, staring out into the hallway, waiting for the voices to return in real time. But the house remained still, eerily so. It felt like the calm before the storm, a silence that weighed down on me with increasing pressure. I was so tired, my eyelids finally drooped, and before I knew it, sleep claimed me. When I awoke, it was still dark outside. The clock beside my bed read 3:17 a.m. And there, faint but unmistakable, I heard them. The voices. This time they weren't just on the recording. They were here, in the room. The voices swirled around me, low and indistinct at first, as if they were blending into the very shadows. My body locked in place, paralyzed by fear, as I strained to catch what they were saying. The darkness of the room felt alive, moving with a presence I couldn't see but could feel, a suffocating weight pressing down on me from all sides. I could hear the faint rustle of movement in the hallway, just outside my open bedroom door. I wanted to scream, to leap from the bed and run, but I couldn't. My muscles refused to cooperate, as if the fear had pinned me in place. The conversation between the two strangers continued, their words clearer now, their tones laced with malicious intent. "Do you think he knows we're here?" the man asked, his voice coming from somewhere near the foot of my bed. I swore I felt the air shift, the coldness of something, or someone, close by. The woman's voice followed, a teasing lilt in her reply. "If he did, he'd be screaming by now. But no, he's still asleep. So fragile, isn't he? So blissfully unaware." Her voice drifted, and I felt her words crawl under my skin, as if they were meant for me, mocking my helplessness. A cold draft swept through the room, and I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. My heart pounded in my chest, hammering so loudly that I feared they might hear it. I wanted to believe this was a nightmare, some twisted figment of my imagination, but the overwhelming reality of it was impossible to deny. This was happening. They were in my house. No, in my room, while I lay frozen, helpless. I tried to move, to shake off whatever force was keeping me pinned to the bed, but my limbs were like dead weight. The sensation of being watched grew unbearable, like eyes boring into me from the shadows. The air felt thick, oppressive, each breath more difficult than the last. My skin prickled with the sense of something unseen drawing closer, inch by inch. And then, the man's voice grew louder. "It's time," he said, with finality. I could feel the weight of his words sinking into me. "He won't escape tonight." Suddenly, a flicker of movement at the foot of my bed caught my full attention. The darkness there seemed to ripple, like a shadow breaking free from the floor, rising. Slowly, deliberately, a figure began to take shape, emerging from the black void of the room. Its form was human, but wrong, its limbs too long, its posture hunched, like it had been twisted out of something once familiar. The head tilted at an unnatural angle, and though I couldn't see its face, I knew it was looking right at me. I tried to scream, to thrash, to do anything to wake myself from this nightmare, but the paralysis held me captive. The figure took a step forward, closer. The voices grew quieter, like they were stepping back, letting the creature take over. And as it loomed over the foot of my bed, I realized with bone-chilling horror that this wasn't just about a recording, or whispers in the dark. Whatever they were planning, it was about to happen. The creature stood at the foot of my bed, its elongated limbs casting long, unnatural shadows across the room. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was stare into the abyss where its face should have been, and in that moment, I understood, I was not dreaming. This was real. The voices, the conversations, they had been preparing for this. Preparing for me. The man's voice broke the silence again, low and commanding. Now, let him see. The creature moved closer, its distorted body bending in ways that made my stomach lurch. With each step, the room seemed to warp around it, the walls narrowing, the ceiling pressing down. It reached out a hand, no, a claw, long and sharp like bone exposed, and I knew it was about to touch me, to pull me into whatever nightmare it had crawled from. And then, as if by some miracle, I gasped. Air flooded my lungs, and the paralysis shattered. I bolted upright in bed, heart racing, eyes darting around the room. The creature was gone. The voices were silent. But I knew it hadn't been a dream. My skin still prickled with cold, the weight of the fear still pressing down on me. Frantically, I grabbed the sleep recorder. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the buttons, desperate to hear what it had captured. I had to know, had to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. The device beeped, and the recording from the night played back. At first, it was just my own breathing, shallow and quick. Then, faintly at first, the voices returned. "He's awake now," the man said, almost amused. The woman responded, her voice dripping with cold satisfaction. "Good. Let him hear the truth." I leaned in closer, heart pounding in my ears. What truth? What was this all leading to? My hands gripped the recorder as if it was the only thing keeping me tethered to sanity. And then, the words came, words that changed everything. "We've been with him since the beginning," the man whispered. "Watching. Waiting. He doesn't remember, but we do." My breath hitched. What were they talking about? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. I had no memory of them, no idea how long this had been happening. But the woman's next words hit me like a punch to the gut. "It's not the recording that brought us here. It's him. We've always been here, lurking in the dark, waiting for him to wake up." I felt the blood drain from my face as a flood of memories rushed back, half-formed images of shadowy figures from my childhood nightmares, the feeling of being watched that I dismissed for years, the strange occurrences that I'd always chalked up to overactive imagination. They weren't figments of my mind. They were real. And they had been with me all along, waiting for the right moment. Suddenly, the recording cut off, replaced by static. But within the static, something else emerged, a low, distorted laugh. And then, just as I thought the recording had ended, the man's voice spoke one last time. "We're inside now. And we're never leaving." I dropped the recorder, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The air in the room felt thicker, as if the walls were closing in on me again. The shadows moved, swirling around me. I realized with dawning horror that I hadn't escaped. They had always been a part of me. And now, they were in control. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 3. The Unseen Faces. The house was old, far older than I had realized when I first agreed to rent it. When I moved in, I told myself that the cracks in the ceiling, the uneven floors, and the strange drafts that lingered around the windows were all part of the charm. A fixer-upper, the landlord had called it. But what caught my attention the most was the wallpaper in my bedroom. It was a deep maroon, elegant and embossed with intricate floral patterns, but something about it felt off. At first, I thought it was just the age of the paper, how it peeled slightly at the edges or how the shadows in the room played tricks on my eyes. Then I saw them. It happened late one night, just after I'd unpacked the last box. Exhausted, I had collapsed into bed, staring absently at the walls as I tried to wind down. That's when I noticed something, faces, faint and shifting, like specters hidden behind the maroon swirls. They seemed to flicker in the dim light, like watching someone move just outside your peripheral vision. I blinked hard, thinking it was my imagination, but each time I looked away and back, The shapes were still there. They were gone if I looked too closely, but as soon as I relaxed my gaze, they returned. I laughed it off at first, chalking it up to fatigue. "You're just tired, Emily," I told myself aloud, as if the sound of my own voice would banish the eerie sensation. But deep down, I could feel the chill creep up my spine, a prickling awareness that something was very, very wrong. Still, I turned off the light and pulled the covers over my head, convincing myself it was nothing. The next morning, the wallpaper seemed perfectly normal in the daylight, and I almost laughed at myself for being spooked. Still, a strange tension lingered. It was as though the room had been watching me all night. That evening, I called my best friend, Jess, and told her about it. She was quick to brush it off. "You're probably just adjusting to the new place," she said, her voice light. "Old houses have a way of playing tricks on you. You'll get used to it." I wanted to believe her. But as the days passed, the faces became clearer. They were never there when I focused on them directly, but they moved in the corners of my vision, like restless shadows waiting to be acknowledged. Sometimes, they seemed angry, twisted expressions of silent rage. Other times, they were simply there, watching, unblinking, unrelenting. I tried to ignore them, but it was as if the wallpaper itself was alive, breathing, shifting with each passing hour. That night, as I lay in bed, staring again at the walls, I swore I heard something. A soft, barely perceptible whisper, just under the sound of the wind outside. My heart began to race. It wasn't just a trick of the eyes anymore. Something was there, something watching me, and it was growing bolder. The whispers grew louder as the night went on. At first, it was nothing more than the faintest breath of sound, like wind brushing against the window. But as I lay there, heart pounding, I realized it wasn't outside. The noise was coming from inside the room, as though the very walls were breathing, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. My stomach tightened with fear, and I gripped the edges of the blanket, trying to convince myself I wasn't hearing what I thought I was. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. I let out a shaky breath, the tension draining from my body. Maybe I was just imagining it, I thought. Maybe it was all in my head. But the moment I closed my eyes, something scraped against the floor. A sound so sharp, so distinct, it sliced through the silence like a knife. I shot up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes scanned the room, trying to find the source of the noise, but nothing seemed out of place. The air was thick with a strange stillness, like the world was holding its breath. And then I saw it. One of the faces, a grotesque, warped expression that seemed to be seeping through the wallpaper, twisted into a hideous grin. This time, I didn't just see it from the corner of my eye. It was right there, directly in front of me, staring back with hollow eyes. My heart stopped. I blinked, but the face remained. Panic surged through me as I scrambled backward, nearly falling off the bed. How was this possible? I had looked directly at it, and it didn't disappear like before. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light swept across the wall, and the face vanished, melting back into the swirling pattern. My chest heaved with heavy breaths as I struggled to regain control. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself. Just my imagination playing with the shadows. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with this house. The next day, I decided to inspect the wallpaper more closely. I peeled back a small corner in the farthest part of the room, just enough to see what was underneath. To my surprise, there was nothing but bare plaster, no mold, no strange markings, nothing that could explain the faces I'd been seeing. Yet I couldn't get rid of the nagging feeling that the wallpaper was hiding something. I decided to call Jess again. I needed to talk to someone, anyone, to make sense of this. When she picked up, her voice was casual, unconcerned, as if I wasn't teetering on the edge of madness. "Maybe it's just old wallpaper playing tricks," she suggested with a laugh. "You've always had an overactive imagination, Em. Want me to come over and keep you company?" I hesitated. Part of me didn't want her to see what I had been seeing, didn't want to share this creeping dread with anyone else. But at the same time, I was desperate for reassurance, for someone to tell me that I wasn't losing my mind. "Yeah," I said finally. "That would be great." Jess arrived later that evening, her usual cheerful self, completely oblivious to the tension I had been living with for days. As soon as she stepped through the door, she gave me a tight hug and plopped herself onto my couch, her carefree laugh echoing in the room. It was comforting, in a way, having her here. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had overreacted, let my imagination run wild in the loneliness of this old house. "So," Jess said, leaning forward with a grin, "where's this creepy wallpaper of yours?" I laughed nervously, trying to play it off as nothing. "It's in the bedroom. But honestly, it's not as bad as I made it sound. I think I was just tired." Jess raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "You sounded pretty freaked out over the phone. Come on, show me." We made our way to the bedroom, and as soon as we stepped inside, I felt it again, that oppressive, suffocating presence. The air was heavy, almost too still, like the room was waiting for something. Jess walked straight to the wall, running her fingers over the maroon wallpaper, her face scrunched in mock concentration. "Well," she said, "it's ugly, but I don't see any faces." For a moment, I almost believed her. Maybe it had all been in my head after all. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. A face, pressing out of the wallpaper like something trapped behind it, its eyes wide and desperate. I flinched, my breath catching in my throat. Jess noticed my reaction immediately. "What? What is it?" "There." I pointed, my hand trembling as I indicated the spot where the face had been. But it was gone, melted back into the intricate floral pattern. There was a face. I swear, Jess, it was right there. She frowned, stepping closer to the wall. "Emily, I'm not seeing anything." "You sure you're not?" Before she could finish, the lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. When they came back on, Jess was staring directly at the wall, her expression frozen in shock. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded slowly, my heart racing. "What did you see?" "I don't know. I thought I saw something," Jess muttered, stepping back from the wall. For the first time since she arrived, I saw real fear in her eyes. "Maybe we should leave this room," she suggested, her voice shaky. But as we turned to go, the door slammed shut on its own with a deafening thud. We both jumped, panic rising in our throats. Jess ran to the door, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "What the hell?" she gasped, pulling harder. "Jess!" I shouted, pointing to the wall behind her. The wallpaper was shifting, warping, as if something was moving underneath it. Dozens of faces, all twisted in agony, were pressing against the surface, their mouths open in silent screams. The grotesque expressions rippled across the room, growing bolder, more defined with each passing second. I could feel them watching us, their presence oppressive and suffocating. "We need to get out of here," Jess cried, her voice rising in fear. I tried to help her with the door, but it was like something was holding it shut from the other side. The whispers returned, louder this time, like a chorus of voices just beyond our reach. "Jess, this isn't right," I said, my voice trembling. "Something's here. Something's trapped inside these walls." Her eyes widened in terror as she turned to face me. "What do you mean? What's in here?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But it doesn't want us to leave." Jess and I stood frozen, staring at the writhing faces pressing out of the wallpaper. The whispers, once faint and distant, were now unmistakable, guttural, inhuman. The wall seemed to pulse with life, and the faces twisted in agony, their mouths moving in a frenzy of silent cries. It was as if they were begging for something, but I didn't know what. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "We have to find another way out," I stammered, trying to suppress the rising panic. Jess nodded, her face pale as she glanced around the room. But every exit seemed blocked, every window sealed shut as if the house itself had decided we weren't allowed to leave. I moved toward the window, hoping against hope that I could pry it open, but the moment I touched the frame, the glass frosted over with a thick layer of ice. The cold radiated through my hand, and I yanked it back with a gasp. "It won't let us leave," Jess whispered, her voice filled with dread. "Emily, what is happening?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice trembling. "But it started with the wallpaper. It's like the faces are trying to get out. The room seemed to close in on us, the walls pressing inward, and with them, the faces. They moved, twisting and shifting with increasing urgency, as though they were pushing harder, closer. The grotesque expressions morphed between pain and fury, their eyes fixed on us now, locked in a silent rage. I could feel their hatred, their desperation. And then, with a sickening clarity, I realized, they weren't just trapped in the wallpaper. They were the wallpaper. What if? I hesitated, my throat dry, but the words forced themselves out. What if these faces, these people, were trapped here? What if they're trying to pull us in, too? Jess backed away from the walls, her eyes wide with terror. We're not staying to find out. Just then, the floor beneath us creaked violently, and a deep rumble reverberated through the house. The air was thick with the smell of damp rot, like the stench of something long dead. The wallpaper peeled back in places, revealing dark, gaping holes behind it. Inside those holes were not empty spaces but something moving. Something alive. Jess screamed, pulling at the door again, but it refused to budge. From the darkness behind the wallpaper, something slithered out, long, thin, like tendrils of smoke and flesh combined. They moved with sickening grace, snaking across the floor toward us. I grabbed Jess, pulling her back as we both stumbled away, but the tendrils stretched farther, faster, reaching for us. The faces were screaming now, their mouths wide open, their silent cries filled with despair. We have to do something. Jess yelled, panic overtaking her as one of the tendrils grazed her ankle, curling around her leg with an icy grip. In desperation, I tore at the wallpaper, ripping it from the walls in large sheets, trying to stop whatever was coming. But beneath each layer I tore away, there were more faces, more eyes watching us. It was endless. The house groaned, as though it were alive, hungry, and we were trapped in its belly. The tendrils grew thicker, stronger, pulling Jess down. Emily! She screamed, clawing at the floor, her eyes wild with terror as they dragged her toward the wall. Don't let them take me. I tried to hold on to her, but the force was too strong. She was being consumed by the house itself. The last thing I saw was her face, twisted in horror, before she was swallowed whole by the wallpaper, her body absorbed into the grotesque pattern. I stood alone in the now silent room, my mind reeling. The faces in the wallpaper had multiplied, and Jess's face was among them now, her eyes wide with the same eternal fear that I had seen in all the others. She was trapped, just like them, her silent scream forever etched into the walls. The whispers were louder than ever, surrounding me from all sides, and I knew, deep down, that the house wasn't finished. I backed into the center of the room, my body trembling. The walls were closing in again, the faces watching with hunger. I could feel their cold eyes on my skin, feel the pull of the wallpaper as it rippled like something alive. There was no escape. I was next. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.